I want to talk today about risk, and I want to differentiate between something called uncertainty and something called risk. Uncertainty is simply that we don't know. And there are all kinds of sources of uncertainty. We don't have knowledge, we don't have data, we don't have foresight. But uncertainty is different from risk. Risk is something that we know about. If you smoke cigarettes, we can tell you what the risk of your getting cancer will be. Now, that risk is in the population as a whole. I can't tell you whether you yourself will get cancer. There are people who smoke all their lives and never get cancer, never get heart disease. But in the population as a whole, I can say the probability, if you smoke, of your getting cancer is X. So when we talk about risk, we're really talking about something we can actually quantify. We put a probability on it. And not only put a probability on the occurrence, we can also generally estimate the likely impact. What will be the cost of any untoward event that might occur? We can't do that with uncertainty. Uncertainty is just not really knowable, but it's a fact of life. And we have to manage both. You've all learned in finance that there ought to be a higher return if you're taking greater risk. Well, that's true. Interestingly enough, many firms don't invest that way. If you have a riskier new product, you really ought to be expecting a higher rate of return than if you have a simple extension of the existing product into the existing market. That's relatively low risk. So I wouldn't expect as much return, but that's because there's less risk. So in thinking about how you manage businesses and manage products, part of what you want to think about is what's the risk that we're taking, what's the nature of that risk, and how we manage it. In thinking about uncertainty, it's been said that there are things we know, what we know. For example, we know with certainty how many 35-year-olds there are in the United States. And by the way, we couldn't have known that 30 years ago. It's easy to forecast. So there are things that we know, and we can deal with them. And if we know what's going to happen with the population 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we can begin to develop business strategies to accommodate those changes that we know about. There are also things that we know we don't know. We don't know exactly what the weather is going to be a year from now. We know there'll be weather, probably. And we can make some basic forecast. But we know we don't really know exactly what the temperature will be on a given day a year from now, or 5 years from now. Nonetheless, we know that there's weather, we can think about it, think about the parameters, and perhaps accommodate that. However, there are also things that we don't know. And that's where the real problem comes in. It's hard to plan for things you not only don't know, but you don't even know you don't know. Some people will refer to these things as black swans. Any of you heard the term black swan? In reality, a black swan is a very rare bird. But people refer to black swans as really unexpected, rare events, but often that have catastrophic outcomes. It's an example of things that we didn't know, and we didn't know we didn't know. So let me give you some examples of black swans. World War I. Nobody expected World War I to start. It occurred because an assassin killed a crown prince of a small country. How could that possibly have created a world war that drew in most countries? It's just unanticipated. The dissolution of the Soviet Union. For years, the Soviet Union was the great evil empire, to use Ronald Reagan's term. And then one morning we got up and it was gone. It just dissolved. Nobody anticipated it. It made big changes. There are now countries that came out of the Soviet Union that are now prosperous capitalist countries. The September 11th terrorist attacks. Who could have possibly imagined aircraft being deliberately flown into the World Trade Center? And not just one, but two. The personal computer was really kind of a black swan. Who would have dreamed of that? Yeah, we had some science fiction writers who talked about being able to handle lots of information. But the reality of the personal computer, nobody really dreamed about until we created one. The internet. Think about how the internet has transformed our lives. I'm old enough that I can remember the non-internet period when I didn't have to get up every morning and immediately check my email. Now I do that instinctively. But it's been dramatically life-changing for people. In a business context, the dot-com crash in 2000, we had this great technology boom that occurred throughout this latter half of the 1990s. And it looked like it was going to go on forever. Technology was great. And suddenly, it all fell apart. Stock market went down. Similarly, the financial crisis in 2007 to about 2010, nobody really saw that coming. The economy was growing rapidly, and then suddenly the bottom fell. Here's what happened with the dot-com crash. Lots and lots of growth, an all-time high of the NASDAQ, and within a year, dramatic decline. Lots of businesses went out of business. Lots of people lost jobs. By the way, if you were a supplier to some of these businesses, suddenly you didn't have anybody to supply. So the ripple effect was quite dramatic. And it's hard to plan for that kind of event. This was the financial crisis. This is what happened with the stock market, and the brown line is consumer sentiment, how people felt about the economy. Dramatic drop, and by the way, it didn't recover real fast. At the time this occurred, I was living and working in Riverside, California. At the time I went to Riverside, that area in California had been responsible for 42% of all the new jobs created in California in the previous 5 years. Tremendous growth in the area. Within a year of this occurring, the unemployment rate was over 15%. 1 in 8 homes was in foreclosure. And you can imagine what that did to all the businesses that were in the area. Again, hard to anticipate, but these things do occur. So when we think about risk, and we're going to talk about how you manage risk, but there are also occasions where you get these kinds of black swans that you just have to be prepared to respond to because you didn't know they were coming. By the way, a black swan, something may be a black swan to you and not somebody else. You know, the Thanksgiving turkey might think that Thanksgiving Day is a black swan. The butcher probably doesn't think so. So as I said, risk is something with a known specific probability and a known or at least estimable loss. And we'll talk about how financial people estimate risk in a few minutes. But risk is actually a lot easier to manage than uncertainty, but there are ways to manage uncertainty as well. Here's a way to kind of measure risk, define it, being the impact scale of some kind and a probability scale. So here's from extreme, maybe we're thinking in terms of a disease. It could range from fatality and multiple fatalities expected to we really shouldn't be concerned at all. Probability, highly likely, or not likely at all in some scale. Obviously, what we want to pay most attention to are those things with a very high probability, where the impact is really great. There is no way that we could possibly live our lives if we were trying to deal with every risk in our lives. You take a risk every time you cross the street. You don't want to live your life worrying about that kind of risk. So businesses really have to manage risk. And they do that in a whole variety of ways. We do this with people, we do this with the environment. State and federal laws are designed to help us manage risk. But the idea is to try to reduce the adverse effects associated with risk. Generally, when we talk about business, we're talking about the possibility of a financial loss. And by the way, the financial loss can come in a variety of ways. Yeah, you may put a product in the marketplace, spend lots of money in R&D and advertising, and it flop in the marketplace, and you've lost money. On the other hand, the risk could be you've been selling baby powder for 100 years, and somebody discovers that it has a carcinogen in it and files a class action lawsuit, and a jury says the company now owes $100 million. By the way, they just happened. That's also a risk. And so you have to, that's another risk you have to manage. It's not just the risk of a product failure or a service failure. There's a whole set of other risks that may be present that we have to accommodate. There are a bunch of sources of risk. A lot of these are things we can anticipate. They're economic issues, they're natural issues, human issues, technological issues, political issues. Let me just give you some examples of some of these, and we'll talk a little bit about what the implications might be for a business. All kinds of economic risks. And they range from the general economy to the very specific circumstances of a particular market in which you're competing. So, for example, there's risk associated with the amount and type of competition. Who are your competitors? Who are they today? Who might they be in the future? Is competition going to increase? Is it going to decrease? And what will be the impact? Competition often puts downward pressure on margins. Prices in the marketplace and ultimately margins. So the question becomes one of how are you going to manage that? How do you accommodate that? Not generally something we can readily control. Our lifestyles, changing lifestyles. People's behavior changes over time. Your needs, interests, concerns are different from mine because we're at different life stages. The Saturn example that I talked about in class was a case in which General Motors simply failed to accommodate the changes in lifestyle. They had a great successful car. And then the market got older, needed a bigger car. They didn't have one for them. They could have anticipated that. By the way, they eventually did launch a larger car, but it's too late. Changes in population. Just the size of the population. By the way, the populations of Germany, Italy, Spain, Japan are actually getting smaller. What's the implication of a population shrinking? I mean, all the things that people buy, there are going to be fewer of those sold. But the countries I just mentioned and a few others simply their birth rates and immigration rates are not sufficient to maintain even the current size of the population. So the populations are going to shrink. They already are shrinking. By the way, they're also getting older. The good news in the U.S. is that between birth rates and immigration, we actually still have population growth. It's not large, but it's still positive. That's good news. Some products simply become less useful or they go out of style. If you're in the fashion industry, things that were once really hot suddenly are not so hot. If you go up to Palo Alto and visit the headquarters of Hewlett Packard, they have preserved the original offices of Bill and Dave, the founders, Hewlett Packard. If you walk into their offices, the carpet is a beautiful avocado green. It reflected the style at the time. We don't sell any avocado green carpets anymore. Change in style. Our products just become obsolete. We have no longer any need for them. More than half of all households today no longer have a landline. They simply use a cell phone. That's their primary phone. So all those landlines that people used to have, the Princess telephones and whatever, they're just obsolete. Inflation, we don't worry too much about inflation these days in the U.S. It's 2% maybe. It's higher in some categories. But inflation can have a dramatic effect on prices. If you lived in Argentina, or actually the basket case right now is Venezuela. In Venezuela, the inflation rate is 1,000% per month. What good is money? I get my paycheck. It's going to be worthless tomorrow. By the way, you know what people do? They immediately spend it. Because there's no point in saving. So there's a mad rush. What can I buy? Because I've got money right now and it's actually worth something. By the way, it makes it very hard for anybody to do long-term planning. It makes it very hard for businesses to invest in things like capital equipment. So it has a dramatic effect. Recessions, people stop buying. The best indicator of the health of the economy is something we call the Consumer Sentiment Index. How do people feel about the economy? Do they feel good about it? Feel like they're going to be better off next year? I feel really good about it. Okay, it's time to go buy stuff. New car, new appliances, new home, whatever. Suddenly, a recession hits. I may not have lost my job, but I know 3 people who have. Suddenly, I don't feel very good about life, and I stop spending. By the way, when I stop spending, then firms don't make much money. They lay off more people. It just creates a vicious cycle. And then government regulation, changes in how people are governed. We have just been in the process of substantially restricting vaping. It's a big growth industry for a while. And then suddenly there were some problems. We're still not quite sure exactly what those problems were. We're not sure exactly the legal products or whether it was what people were doing with those products. But government has intervened, and suddenly it's not such a great industry anymore. Some of this is just about predicting the future. I mean, we can think about what's going to happen to the population over time. You know, if you're in your age, your 20s, you know, you're a big market for apartments. You know, as you grow older, you'll probably be more concerned with buying a home. Maybe you'll have children. As you get a little older, maybe you'll trade up to a larger home. Larger home, you need more furniture. Kids get older, got to pay tuition. You buy more automobiles, different automobiles. Begin to hit senior citizen status, and now that building that you seldom gone into, called a hospital, you may be visiting more often. But at the same time, you may have more leisure time, you may be taking more vacations, more cruises. But you got to be sure that you got all your prescriptions to take with you. And then ultimately, at the end, people die, and there's a business in the death business. There are funeral homes, mortuaries, crematoria. By the way, that's going to be a boom industry in the next 20 years. Because all the boomers, a big part of the population, is going to die off. I know it's kind of a morbid thought, but it's the nature of what's going to happen, and we can predict it. And so if we can predict it, we can anticipate it, and we can be prepared to respond to it. But it's all about understanding what is the risk, and conversely, what's the opportunity that may be created by these kinds of population trends. Natural disasters, natural risks from natural causes. You know, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, fires, lightning, droughts, earthquakes, just unexpected changes in the weather. Some of these things we can anticipate, some we can insure against, but a lot we can't insure against. And so I have to think about how I'm going to manage that. The single best predictor of soft drink consumption is the average daily temperature in the market. So if it's really hot, and I'm in the soft drink business, my sales go up. If it's unexpectedly cool on the soft drink business, my sales go down. And I don't have any real way to control that. I just have to respond to it. We've been experiencing fires all over Southern California. What's the impact of that on businesses? Multiple impacts. First of all, there are people, sadly, whose homes have burned. Many of them are insured, but they're going to have to rebuild. By the way, when they rebuild, that's going to be work for contractors, for lumber companies, appliance companies, and what have you. On the other hand, there are stores that on a given day, because of a fire, could not open. A small business, you depend on people coming in, and suddenly for 3 days, no customers can get to. Big impact on your business. And think about how we can respond to that. What are the contingencies? Here are some of the worst catastrophes last year. The mudslides just north of here in Chico. Shut down roads. A lot of businesses that actually went out of business because customers couldn't get to them. The flooding in Maryland, a couple of hurricanes, and of course, every year we seem to have wildfires here in California. Big impact. Some of that impact is negative. People can't get to a store. Some of that impact may be positive because after the disaster, people often need to rebuild, and that creates a market for certain things. Most people don't think about how important the weather is, but it's very, very important. There's all kinds of human risk. Rise from mistakes, from just people being unpredictable, from employees, from the work environment. You know, you get things like dishonesty, you have theft, fraudulent payment, non-payment. Gee, I thought that was a good customer. Just took them a really nice new car, but they're not paying for it. They're defaulting on their loan. By the way, there's a big business in repossession. Employees make errors, or they're negligent, or they're incompetent, or they steal things from you. When ports, like the ports here in Southern California and elsewhere, were being automated, we were going to big shipping containers and big cranes, it was fought by the labor unions. And one of the reasons it was fought was because the labor unions had an understanding with the folks they worked with that they were entitled to steal up to 10% of whatever goods were being shipped. That was part of their compensation. And when we automated, that ceased to be possible because now everything was locked away in big containers. But that was the case where we really institutionalized theft. It was part of their compensation. You have customer and employee accidents. I mean, these are all risks. Here are some examples. Controlled burns that suddenly burn uncontrollably. We have a big problem with that in Southern California. We do a lot of controlled burns, ostensibly to help control fires, but sometimes they get out of control. The Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. This was a case where there was some insulating covering on the outside of the shuttle, and it was known to some people that there had been damage. But the shuttle was launched anyway, and upon re-entry, because of that problem with the insulation, it disintegrated. That was not a technology error, that was a human error. The Bangladesh building collapse. You may or may not have seen this in the news, but a huge building in Bangladesh just collapsed. In fact, this is another case where they knew there was a problem. In fact, they evacuated people, and then the people were told to come back to the facility, and it collapsed. The 3 Mile Island disaster, nuclear disaster, Chernobyl, another disaster. These were not technical problems, these were human problems. Bernie Madoff stole billions of dollars from people through fraud, through a Ponzi scheme. That's not an error, that's just outright dishonesty. And there's technological risk. New technology replaces old. DOS was replaced by Windows. Or BlackBerry was replaced by Apple and Android. Are you running a business on the internet and your website crashes? By the way, this is equivalent to people can't get to your store. Or you have a big security breach that results in data loss. and then somebody decides to sue you. Or you have an order entry system, an automated order entry system that makes all kinds of illogical orders. Just randomly creates orders, and that happens. I mean, here's some failures of technology. One of the great examples of technology failures was a version of Windows called Vista. That was a few years ago, but it was a real disaster. It resulted in some lawsuits and some real problems for Microsoft. I mentioned the BlackBerry. I can remember the time when everybody seemed to have a BlackBerry. You don't find those around anymore. Southwest, United, Delta have all had router outages, computer problems. And by the way, when they had those, they couldn't fly. So literally thousands of people stranded because they weren't able to fly. Data breaches, Target, Yahoo. Sony had a digital rights management system built into a lot of its products, its recordings, and so forth. Actually, it turned out that when you would play it on your computer, it would download malware onto your computer. Pepsi in the Philippines had a bottling glitch. They put numbers on bottles. It was a contest. They put numbers. And if you got a particular number, you won $1 million. $1 million. But they had a glitch. The winning number wasn't put on one bottle. It was put on thousands. And then, of course, Dell had a feature associated with its computers. The batteries caught fire. That's an example. That's a Dell computer on fire right there as a result of the battery. It's a technology failure. And there's all kinds of political risks. Risks that arise from just political events. War and violence. There's some parts of the world where we don't even go there. It's dangerous. In the news, we've heard a lot about trade disputes. Trade disputes especially with China. Political instability. The Israelis are about to have probably their third election in a year. Kind of hard to run a country when you're having to re-elect people. Just changes in policy over time. Changing tax rates. Turns out that we can really spur the economy on by cutting taxes. Or we can make it contract by increasing taxes. It's a change in policy. And here's some examples. Brexit. I spent last fall in the UK and got to see Brexit up close. It's not pretty. They're still trying to figure it out. They're now on their third prime minister trying to resolve the issue. And there are huge issues that involve not just risk but uncertainty. Because nobody knows exactly what's going to transpire. Because nobody knows exactly what Brexit's going to be. Hong Kong used to be one of the most stable places in the world. Lovely, lovely place. The instability now, it's there, has made it a not very attractive place. I mentioned the U.S.-China trade dispute, war in the Mideast. I misspelled Chile, but the protests in Chile, South America. Again, one of the most prosperous countries in South America, very stable for a long time, and suddenly people are rioting. What would have been a good place to do business, maybe not so much anymore. The Trump impeachment. What's the Trump impeachment doing to markets? Creating a lot of uncertainty for sure. By the way, this is a sign in the UK. Just hoot. We go and leave. All of these types of risks and uncertainties are things that we need to be cognizant of and try to factor into our planning. Most of them we can't prevent, but most of them we can at least anticipate. In finance, the way risk is defined is variability in cash flow over time. A non-risky business would be one that has a really nice, steady, even flow of cash over time. A risky business is one where the cash flow goes up and down. It's really difficult, really risky if it's up and down in a fairly unpredictable fashion. And of course, zero cash flow or negative cash flow is really bad. Finance people think in terms of certain types of risk. They don't think in terms of the source of risk. They think in terms of systematic and unsystematic risk. Systematic risk are the things that are happening around us. What's happening with the economy? What's happening with the population? And those things tend to affect all businesses, although they may affect different businesses in different ways. So, for example, when we have a recession, businesses often are influenced. But even in the same industry, the influence may be different. Because what happens in recessions is that people tend to trade down in their spending. So if you're in a restaurant and you are in a high-end, full-service restaurant, people tend to go to those restaurants less in a recession. When they don't stop eating out. They go to the family restaurant. By the way, the folks who used to go to the family restaurant now go to the quick service fast food restaurant. Anyway, stop eating out, it's changed where they're eating. The people who used to go to the fast food restaurant now go to the grocery store and prepare more of their meals at home. So you get this kind of ripple effect. And it's something you can anticipate, but it's going to have a different effect. The grocery stores actually do well in recessions. Because the reality is people still have to eat. And it's probably the least expensive way for people to eat. So if people are trying to save money, then, well, yeah, I guess we'll go to the grocery store and buy food to prepare ourselves. That's systemic risk. And then there's unsystematic or unsystemic risk. That's really more idiosyncratic. There's risk associated with an individual firm. The people will often talk about that, particularly in the investment community, how risky is a particular firm. We have a firm up in Venice called Snapchat. Very risky firm. Because you have to make a profit. Burning through lots of investment. People would say that's really risky. By the way, it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the economy. It has to do with the fact that they have this competitor called Facebook. And every time Snapchat comes up with a really good idea, Facebook does it. So, but that's firm-specific risk. But from a marketing perspective, we're not so much concerned just with firm-specific risk. we're really concerned with product or service specific risk, because the risk could be much greater for some of our products than for others. I know that people are probably going to buy toothpaste on a regular basis, and they'll do that even in a recession. On the other hand, they might not spend as much on cosmetics. So if I'm Procter & Gamble, I've got a dental hygiene division, I've got a cosmetics division. And the risk that I'm facing in those two divisions is really quite different. And I want to manage differently as a result. So part of what I need to think about is not just, a lot of firms actually have some techniques built in to manage risk, but it's usually at the firm level. And they don't really take into account the product specific level. That's really where the management of risk should happen, is at the product specific level. Yes, we can estimate risk and manage it. Uncertainty is another problem. It's difficult. There are a lot of biases. Most of us would prefer to think that there are no risks. We're all inherently optimists. But it's also very hard to delegate risk. It's really something that requires senior management attention. And every decision that you make as a manager includes some assumptions about risk. You may not articulate them, but you'd be wise to do so. What are we assuming? What are we assuming about the economy? What are we assuming about population growth? What are we assuming about potential natural disaster? The list of potential biases is legion, and I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'll just give you some examples. When you work on a project, you labor on it hours and days and bring a new product to market, you just end up with an attachment to the product. It's got to be successful. Why? Because I worked so hard on it. Well, that may blind you to some of the risks that's present. Or something we sometimes refer to as equalizing bias. Just assume that all risks are equally probable. They're not. We can almost certainly count on wildfires in Southern California. Probably not going to see many tornadoes. We do occasionally, but they're not very common. Different types of risks. Or the gambler's fallacy. You see this in sports all the time. He's got a hot bat. He's hit all kinds of home runs. So that means he's going to perform the same way in the future. No, not necessarily. There'll be a regression back to the mean. If you flip a coin 10 times, you could get 10 heads. Very rare, very unusual, but it could happen. By the way, it doesn't mean that the 11th time you'll get a head, or the 11th time you'll get a tail. The probability is still 50-50 of a head or tail. And finally, one other I'll mention is just sunk cost. Big problem for many firms. We've got to keep going with this project. Why? Because we've already spent $1 million. Yeah, but all the market feedback suggests it's not going to be successful. Yeah, but we've all probably got $1 million in this investment. So we've got to spend more. Well, if you spend more on an unsuccessful idea, all it means is you're losing more. And so the ability to walk away from an unsuccessful project and to do so as early as possible is really important in managing risk, which is why firms often will set up what we call stages and games in decision making, where rather than betting everything all at once, or putting a new product in the market. They'll do some initial evaluation, often just at the concept before they even start working on the physical product. Why? Because they do want to invest, but they'd like to get some feedback on the likely success of that investment as early as possible. And if it looks like it's not going to work, walk away. Yeah, the cost is sunk, but you'll never get that back. But you could get much bigger losses if you keep spending on the project. Longer time horizons inevitably increase risk. If I'm planning for next week, I probably have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen in the next week. Yeah, there could be unexpected events, things I didn't anticipate. But relatively short time horizons, I pretty much know what's going to occur. Get out a year? I'm not so sure. Get out 5 years, and then all bets are off. How many of you know exactly what you're going to be doing 5 years from now? Even generally. No, you don't. You don't know what's going to happen. So what that means is that the longer the time horizon over which we're planning, the more we need to pay attention to how we're going to manage risk. Because not only is there risk that we can foresee and estimate, but there's even uncertainty, things about which we're not aware. So there are a couple of tools that we use, some tools we use in marketing to try to manage risk over longer time horizons. One of those is break-even analysis, and another is payback period. All break-even analysis is how much do we have to sell in units or in dollars before we get back our initial investment. Obviously, the smaller that break-even volume is, break-even revenue is, the less risk we're taking. The bigger the break-even, gee, I've got to sell 2 million units before I even break even. It's a riskier proposition. So sort of looking at that break-even becomes really useful for assessing the likely risks that we're taking. Another way that we might manage risk is by asking how soon, in terms of time, not how many units we have to sell to break even, but how soon will we break even. This is the payback period. So here's an example. We invested $800,000. In year one, we got back $250,000. Year two, we got back $400,000. Year three, we got $300,000. Notice we haven't broken even until we get to year three. Other things being equal, I like a shorter payback period, so I can manage risk. By the way, there's going to be a longer payback period. What should I demand? A higher return. It's riskier. There are all kinds of ways in planning that we can adjust for risk. There's sensitivity analysis. One special case of sensitivity analysis is simply something we call best, worst, and most likely case. But the idea is to identify all of those factors that may influence demand for your product, influence sales for your product, also factors that may influence costs, and then try to play around with what if analysis. If costs were this much, if demand were this much, what would that produce? If we change that so that costs were only 50% the initial estimate, what would happen? What would happen if we got drug approval from the FDA for our new pharmaceutical product in year 6 rather than year 7? Or what would happen if we didn't get it in year 7 and got it in year 10? What would be the impact? What would be the impact of the investment, like a return on that investment? And you can build huge databases that allow you to play really elaborate what-if games. You gotta have lots of data, but you can certainly do that. But a simple way to do this, that can often be done even by small businesses with limited data, is to simply try to imagine what's the best case. If we sold to everybody who wanted one at the highest possible price we can imagine, what would be the outcome? What's the worst case? Nobody shows up to buy our product for a year. And then what's most likely? Probably something in between. But what this allows us to do is kind of bound the problem. I know generally what the worst case is. I can plan, I can build some contingencies in. If you have this really great new product idea, but I gotta get distribution. It's always difficult. So, worst case, it's gonna take me a year before I get substantial distribution. Okay, what are we gonna do in that year? Should we not get distribution for a year? What are the contingency plans? Do we have enough money? Maybe it's just a matter of having enough money to keep the business going until we actually are able to develop the channels of distribution. That happens frequently. People think when you go to venture capitalists, typically what they're funding is R&D, and they do. But often what people go to venture capitalists for is money to actually market, to buy entry into distribution channels, to advertise. Because this is important for creating demand. Another way to adjust for risk is to simply change the discount rate. Change the amount of return that I expect. And I'll talk about this in just a moment. Here's an example, a simple example of best, worst, and most likely case. Best case, we say the market size is 10 million, worst case is 3 million, most likely case in between about 6 million. Best case, we would get 25% share. Worst case, we're going to get 10% share. Most likely case, 20% share. So how does that translate into sales in units? Sales in units range between 2.5 million down to as low as 300,000. What might we assume about price? Let's assume we can get $12 a unit. Best case, only $8 a unit. The worst case, most likely case, $10 a unit. And then we can work the math. Okay, what's the gross revenue going to be? What's the margin going to be? Ultimately, what's the gross contribution going to be? What are marketing expenses going to be? And again, those may vary. In the worst case, you might not spend as much on marketing. And then what's the net contribution going to be? Now, I've got a big range here. Best case, I could be at $15 million in profit. That'd be great. Worst case, I'm going to be at $720,000, which I might look at and say, gee, I can't even pay the staff. Best case, most likely case, 4.8 million. Oh, that's okay, we can live with that. But now I have some sense of what I'm confronting. And I can ask myself, first of all, how quickly can I get some sense of what the market realities are? How quickly can I figure out what the actual size of the market might be? There's one point of uncertainty here and risk is just how big's the market. And for a lot of really new to the world products, we don't know. Actually, for a lot of other businesses, they don't know. I'm going to open a dry cleaner. in a local community. How big's the market? Well, there are ways to actually figure that out. Then what market share am I going to get? We'll be able to do some research to figure that out. But as I gather information, then I can begin to hone in more specifically about what's the likely outcome. And if it looks like this is going to be the outcome, the worst case, how am I going to deal with it? One answer might be we won't even go into business. You know, if you can't handle the worst case, you just don't go into business. I tell my friends who work in product design that a first cut at determining whether an investment's worthwhile is to just imagine if you were able to sell one of your widgets, whatever it is you're making, to everybody who needed one. And if you were able to do that and you still can't make a profit, don't do it. That's actually a pretty easy determinant. And of course, my technology friends then begin to say, well, but that's the market now, but it could be bigger at some point in the future. And then you begin to push back and say, how might it be bigger? Well, you know, technology markets get bigger. No, some markets get bigger, not all. And even if it gets bigger, how fast? It's another example. This is over 5 years. So the reason you have to do it over 1 year, you do it over 5 years. And when you do that, you might even plug in a discount rate and compute a net present value. That discount rate could be something that you use for adjusting for risk. If you believe that you should get higher return on projects involving higher risk, that there should be a higher return on higher risk, then part of what you could do is insist on a higher discount rate, insist on a higher rate of return for more risky projects. We simply call this risk-adjusted return. So you've got a product that you're going to put in the market. It's an extension of the existing product. The brand is well known. You already have channels of distribution. People know about the product. No, not a whole lot of risk there. Some, but not a whole lot. Alternatively, I have a product that's completely new to the world. Nobody knows what it is. I don't have distribution. Not even sure what the demand would be if people knew about it and could get it. That's a much riskier investment. You might still make it. But now maybe I want a 15% return, not a 7% return. And when I start doing my net present value, I plug in the 15%, not 7%, so that I actually get a sense of what I'm looking at. It's a simple example of how you might adjust cash flows. Often in adjusting cash flows, we'll combine this with sensitivity analysis. So we get a sense of what the parameters and variance in demand might be. And we'll then apply a different risk adjustment based on the results of that sensitivity analysis. So in my best, worst, most likely case, rather than applying the same discount rate to each of those scenarios to get net present value, I might use a higher value in the worst case scenario, a lower value in the best case scenario. It's simply a way to try to build in risk. By the way, no firms do this well. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to do it. The good news is that unlike financial investments, buying stocks in the stock market, buying commodities in the commodity market, unlike those investments where you don't really have any control at all. If I buy General Electric stock, I don't have any influence as a stockholder on how that company gets managed. I just have to trust that it's managed well and I'll get a return. Within the firm, though, I have the ability to manage that investment. I can do things that increase the probability of success. And so in marketing, a lot of what we do in the way of risk management is built into processes. There's a consulting firm, Booz Allen, which used to be a well-known new product development consulting firm. They've since become bought by PwC, and most of what they do these days is in defense. But they did a lot of early work on developing R&D processes to manage risk. And you'll still see them referred to. You talk about the Booz Allen processes. Most marketing, not all, but most marketing activities lend themselves to management by process. Things don't have to be all or nothing. You don't have to go in the lab, invent the product, produce millions of units, put it in distribution, and then hope. By the way, that used to be the case. I mean, if you go back to product development practices in the 50s, it wasn't at all unusual for firms to really gear up, produce lots of product, fill the inventory of the channels of distribution, and then wait for something to happen. Huge investment. Really waste. And often when they did that, they would make mistakes. Campbell's Soup, a few years ago, actually when they were a client of mine in the advertising agency, created a food product, a wonderful food product. When people tasted it, they loved it. But they chose to distribute it in a can, kind of an elliptical, odd-looking can. It was distinctive. They wanted something distinctive on the shelf. It was distinctive. Unfortunately, what they discovered after the product was on the market was there is no device known to mankind that can actually easily open that can. The typical can opener doesn't work because of the shape. Now, you might have thought that you had caught that mistake, but somehow or another they didn't. It only cost them a few $1 million. So instead of doing all or nothing, what we try to do is to create steps, stages. And this is the stage gate system that I talked about. Are there natural sets of activities that can go together that when completed lend themselves to a decision, a go, no-go decision? By the way, it's not go, no-go into the market all at once. It's do we go to the next step? And each step involves a little bit additional investment, incremental investment. But at each stage you get feedback. You use that feedback to make a decision. At each stage you might even do an experiment of some kind, take the idea out, expose it to your customers. You may do that in a small way, larger way, and then ultimately make a decision to launch. Finance is still going to want numbers, but one advantage of this is that each stage you actually get numbers. They just get better as you go through the stages and spend more money. Here's an example of a product development process. Start with idea generation. Do we have any ideas? And then based on those ideas, just have a simple little check sheet to evaluate the ideas. Get a management committee in and ask questions about, well, what do we know about the size of the market? Is it a big market? Is it a growing market? The answer is it's not very big and it's not growing. Well, scrap that one. Seemed like a good idea at the time until we looked at it. Is it a good fit for what we do? It's a great market, it's growing. We just don't have any capability to serve that market. We'll scrap that one too. Does it meet our financial objectives? Well, what are your financial objectives? I had a group of students a few years ago, executive MBA students, who did a project in which they came up with a technology to use satellite information to do local forecasting of weather. It actually turns out that we have the ability, technology, to forecast weather literally at the square yard level. And you might say, why is that valuable? Well, if you're a farmer and you're trying to make a decision about whether to harvest or not, you might like to know if it's going to rain. And so they developed a business plan, did a really great job. Technology was feasible, and estimated that they could eventually create a market of about 150 million a year after expenses. Sounds like a really great business. So they happened to all work at Hughes, which is why they were interested in satellites. And Mike Armstrong was the CEO at Hughes at the time. Later went on to be CEO at AT&T. And Mike was very supportive of management education and agreed to have the students make a presentation. They did a great job, they did a wonderful job. And he praised them and told them about how good the analysis was. And at the end, one of the students said, "Wait, is Hughes interesting?" And Mike said, "Well, in our business, we're not interested in any new products or new markets that don't generate at least $1 billion a year." Maybe for somebody else, it's a great product. By the way, it's now available, but not for Hughes, because they had a specific requirement of the size of the cash flow they wanted to be able to generate. So part of screening the ideas are, it's going to be consistent with our business objective. Once we've gotten the ideas and sort of screened them, by the way, it's very inexpensive to do this. And what do we already know, or what can we readily get our hands on, apply and evaluate, and then we'll throw some ideas out, keep some other ideas. The ones we keep, then let's do a more thorough business analysis. The business analysis might be both sizing the market, more specifically, might even be going out and collecting some consumer data, maybe creating a concept to show people, getting feedback. Also involves going to R&D or service operations and say, how much do you think it would cost to create that? And now we have much more hard-nosed business analysis. But notice we don't do that for every idea we generate, because there's going to be costs when I start having to do market research. There's going to be costs when I have to start having R&D engineers take a look at technology. Still less expensive than going ahead and developing them. So now once I've gone through the business analysis and I've said, yeah, it still looks like a really good idea. Now, I'm at another decision point. I can say, okay, I guess we'll spend some money to develop the product. By the way, now we're getting expensive. Because product development, R&D is expensive. So let's develop. By the way, as we start developing the product, a couple of things will happen. One is we'll learn more about technology and feasibility. Things like, well, we thought it was going to cost this much, but we just discovered a technical problem that's going to double the cost. Well, what does that mean in the market? Oh, and we now have a much better idea of what the product will do and how it will look and how it will work. Let's go collect some more customer data. And we can refine things. And it may turn out that the idea is a really poor idea. based on the new information, and we scrap it. Or everything works wonderfully, turns out the business analysis works well, costs of creation of this thing work. Okay, we're now ready to potentially put it in the marketplace. But in a lot of product categories, maybe that doesn't mean doing a big national or international launch. Maybe you just launch in one market and let's see what happens. If I do a national launch, I've got to fill the stores. That's inventory. By the way, another word for inventory is cost. So, can I do a small demonstration project that will let me do proof of concept? And then suddenly, oh, we're gangbusters. Okay, let's take it national or international. But notice that at each stage, what I'm doing is I have a very specific set of activities with a specific investment and a decision point at the end. And what I'm trying to do is to keep the investment in really bad ideas, and I don't always know if something's a bad idea until I start developing it. I want to keep them off the market, and I want to keep the amount invested to a minimum. Recognizing that as I get further into this process, it's going to cost me more money. By the way, I still may take this process all the way to the end and still not make any money. But I have managed my risk and I've increased the probability of success. A couple of ways that we manage risk in this context, particularly for consumer products, is with the use of test markets, or increasingly something called simulated test markets. In a test market, we would do a limited market rollout. So we'd pick a market that's reasonably similar to the market we want to serve, or maybe a couple of markets. We want some variability. In California, Fresno is a common test market. Wichita is a common test market. These tend to be smaller markets that are relatively isolated and can be controlled. Then we put the product in the market and see what happens. Do this for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. See what kind of sales we get. Alternatively, we could do a simulated test market. Simulated test market is really much more of a controlled, almost laboratory type of test. Firms like Nielsen, as a part of their services, offer simulated test markets. What they do is they recruit consumers, bring them into a controlled situation, and have them shop in a controlled situation. It's not a real store. It's a store that resembles a real store, but no, people can't just walk in. And you give people the opportunity to learn about the new product, give them the opportunity to potentially buy it. They buy it, take it home. After they've had a chance to use it, call them back, bring them back in, ask if they'd like to buy again. In fact, you might give them several opportunities to buy again. So you begin to get a sense of what, not only what first-time purchase would be, but what long-term repeat purchase might be. What's nice about these simulated test markets is because they're relatively small and controlled, I can also test marketing activities. So, for example, rather than simply giving people the opportunity to buy, seeing how many people buy, maybe what I do is I give them the product. I'm testing sampling here. So, is sampling going to be worthwhile? Well, I give them the product. 2 weeks later, I call them back. Would you like to buy it again? Yeah, I'd like to buy it. That gives you a sense of, what long-term demand will be. Or I might use a coupon. What size coupon? I can play with price. There are lots of things that I can manipulate in this controlled setting that give me a sense of what might work in a larger market. And those are simply called simulated test markets. By the way, they also have the advantage that your competitors don't know what you're doing. If you're in a test market, your competitors will know tomorrow. Or we might use marketing experiments. We talked about experiments earlier in the course. A common term that you'll hear used, particularly in the context of the internet, is something called A/B testing. A/B testing is simply, I've got two alternatives. I'd like to know which one works better. I've got a product at one price, and the same product at a different price. What happens? When I give people the opportunity to purchase, does price make a difference? How big a difference? How does that translate into potential cash flow? Well, that's risk.